What is going on, everyone? Sarah coming at you from just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. And today, we are going to be doing a video that I have wanted to do for a long time. So, if you've been with us for a while, you'll remember back in May or June of this year, 2020, I uploaded a video discussing the song Talkin Baseball by Terry Cashman. And basically, when I was doing that, I got the idea to do this episode. So why, you might ask? Because this video is going to combine my two favorite things, which are sports and adult animated TV shows, such as Family Guy, Futurama, and, as we will discuss in this episode, The Simpsons. So basically, if it weren't for sports, like when there was a pandemic going on, and when the pandemic was in full swing in the beginning in March through July, I was watching a lot of animated shows, and The Simpsons was, of course, one of them. And I, of course, rewatched the classic from the 1992 year, Season 3's episode, Homer at the Bat. And so basically, the premise of this episode is pretty simple. So, Homer Simpson works at a nuclear power plant, if you didn't know that. And his nuclear power plant has a softball team. Now, this softball team has struggled year after year after year. But in this year in particular, the 91-92 season, whatever you want to call it, the team's doing decent. So Mr. Burns, Homer's boss, makes a bet with a rival nuclear power plant team's owner, and he bets him $1 million that he can win the championship pennant. So what ends up happening is Mr. Burns wants to hire this team full of superstars, and just to date how old Mr. Burns is, his idea of superstars are players like Shoeless Joe Jackson, Cap Anson, and Hannes Wagner, Nap LaJoy. These are all guys that have not been playing baseball for, at the point of this episode, 70 years. Mordecai Three Finger Brown, I think, stopped playing in the early 1900s. So it was that was interesting. And when I was a kid, I didn't get that joke, but now I do. So what happens is Mr. Burns' assistant, Smithers, steps in and says, "Let me get a team for you." So they get a bunch of big names, and we'll discuss each big name momentarily. I don't want to do that right now. But what's interesting is not every single player that they wanted ended up doing it. But what they do is they get these 9 guys. So there's no benches, no relief pitchers, none of that stuff. It's one player at each position. They get the 9 players, and they have them, join the nuclear power plant at dummy positions like, assistant head of a securities assistant or something like that, where the guy does nothing, but he technically works for the plant, so he qualifies for the role. And they sign up for the softball team, obviously. Now, how did they get him? They bribed him. They kidnapped one of them. It's an interesting episode. And they poke a lot of fun at the players. But again, we'll get to that when we discuss the players themselves. But what ends up happening at the end is 8 of the 9 players end up having to bow out of the competition for different reasons. And the only one that's left is the right fielder, which is, of course, Homer's position. If you know baseball, the right fielder is typically excluding DH, the least athletic guy. It's a position that, you don't do a lot of work at. So what ends up happening is Homer steps into bat in the bottom of the inning, at the bottom of the game, at the end of the game, with the game tied, and he gets a hit by pitch and ends up becoming a game-winning hit by pitch. So Homer wins the pennant the championship for the team. And it's a great episode. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. Homer at the Bat, Season 3 of The Simpsons. Turned me into a huge Simpsons fan. Love it. So, what happens is they get all of these players to join the team. So, what I did is I built my own team based on the 2020 MLB season. And I had a couple guidelines I had to follow, and I'll show you my team momentarily. But my guidelines were, the players have to be roughly the same age as the player that they're replacing. So, for example, my right fielder, let's just say, was 30 years old at the time of the recording of this episode. So the right fielder I wanted to replace him with, I have him within a 3-year gap between 29 and 31. So that's how I wanted to do it, just to give myself some boundaries. Although 2 positions I did swap. So they did have one very young player who I swapped positions with because it made sense. I swapped essentially my left and center fielders, I swapped their ages. So, and then the shortstop they had was a very old. There wasn't a shortstop comparable in today's Major League Baseball. So I had to go with a different player for that one. So without further ado, I present to you the homer at the bat, and we're going to start position by position here. So their team, they had Jose Canseco as their starting left fielder. Now, Canseco wasn't really a left fielder, but they put him there, and he was apparently very hard to work with in the process of this episode. So there's that. But what ends up happening with Canseco is they actually had to rewrite his role, because originally he was supposed to miss the whole, the softball game championship, because he was supposed to be with Edna Krabappel. If you know The Simpsons, you can figure out what's happening there. And him and his wife were like, no, we can't do that. That's not acceptable. So they end up having him save a person's house from catching on fire, like save everything. So it was interesting how they did that. They tried to make him a hero because of his attitude. So he's a very infamous player. He's the most infamous player that they had on this team. There's one other guy who comes to mind too who's infamous, but he's the big one. And I replaced him with Juan Soto. Now this is the big age gap difference. So they had Ken Griffey Jr. at center field. We'll get to him momentarily. And he was a young superstar. And I was choosing between Juan Soto and one other guy to be my young superstar. I went with Soto just because of the lack of talent at left field behind him. Now, there's some great left fielders in the league, don't get me wrong, but there were other positions I liked more with young talent or with other talent. So I went with Soto. Soto, obviously, one of the key players in the Nationals, finally winning their first World Series. And he's a great player. He definitely looks like he's going to be Cooperstown bound at some point soon. Very happy to have Juan on my team. In the center field spot, Ken Griffey Jr. So Ken Griffey Jr., he was the young superstar on this team. And what ends up happening to him is he takes this nerve tonic, and it ends up giving him gigantism, which is obviously a fake disease that essentially makes it so his head and his body, all like his limbs, they just get really big. Remember, it's cartoons, joke. But he gets addicted to it. So that's what happens with Ken Griffey Jr. And you can't not have Mike Trout on this team. So I had to put Mike Trout on this team. It was a no-brainer. Mike Trout, just the face of baseball. I mean, that was the easiest decision I had to make. I didn't even think twice about this one. I went with Mike Trout. I didn't even look at any other center fielders. I knew Mike Trout was going to be my guy. So the right fielder they had was Darryl Strawberry. Now, Darryl Strawberry is the only player here who actually took part in the game. And he was an interesting player in real life. He's one of the few people who said, this episode really gave me international acclaim. And it did. It really helped him out. He was on the Mets, so he didn't really have the market that he would have had in other cities. And I replaced him with Bryce Harper. Now, you might be saying, why Bryce Harper? Because you're a Phillies fan, right? Well, Bryce Harper has the personality that I could definitely see him jumping in here and saying, I'm doing this. I could see him being the guy to call the Simpsons and say, I want to do this. I want to be in this episode. Whereas everyone else would get the phone calls, Bryce would be the guy to step in and say it. I mean, Bryce is still young. He's around the same age as Strawberry was during the time of this episode. He's got the power, what you want in this type of team. And it's just, I was very, very happy to have Bryce. Bryce was my second easiest decision to make. Going into the infield, we'll go with first base. So at first base, they had Don Mattingly. So how they got rid of Mattingly was kind of weird. They essentially had this whole sideburns thing because Mr. Burns is an old guy and Don Mattingly has his sideburns. And basically Mattingly, Mr. Burns tells him, shave those sideburns. He's like, what do you mean? And he just says, get out and shave the sideburns. He comes back, he literally shaved his hair completely, and Mr. Burns looks at him and says, Mattingly, I told you to shave those sideburns. You're fired. Get out of here. And he walks away, and under his breath he says, I still like him better than Steinbrenner. So that was a pretty funny comment to make. And what's really funny is actually a year after this episode airs, we get a controversy in real life with Steinbrenner getting upset about Don Mattingly's hair. So the Simpsons predicted the future. But I replaced him with Freddie Freeman. And this was the most difficult decision I had to make between Freddie Freeman and Jose Abreu. And I went with Freeman just because he was a little better earlier. So Freeman in his past 3 years has had a little bit more success, not including the 2020 season, than Jose Abreu. So I went with Freddie Freeman. And Freddie Freeman, obviously, he might not have the exact same power, but he does a lot of other stuff that Abreu doesn't do. It was such a tough decision to go with Freeman over Abreu. But I looked at Baseball Reference, I looked at how they were doing, and I saw that Freeman's been more involved in the MVP races in recent years. I mean, they both won it this 2020 season, but I had to go with Freeman over Abreu. Freeman would be a great guy to have on this team too. At second base, here's our controversial character to replace Jose Canseco, and of course, it's another Jose. So they had Steve Sax. Now, Steve Sax was another interesting guy. So they originally wanted Ryan Sandberg, who was the best second baseman in baseball at that point in time. And yeah, his career was coming to a close, but he said no. So they had to go with Steve Sax. And what happens with Steve Sax is he gets pulled over by the police, and they arrest him, they put him in jail, and yeah, so it was kind of a weird thing. And he's talking to the police, and then he's like, oh, yeah, well, there's hundreds of unsolved murders in New York. And the police look at each other and they're like, oh, we got this guy. He just admitted to all these murders. So having Altuve replace him. Altuve, was around the same age Sax was during this episode. And Altuve is, again, a polarizing character. I know that. But it was exciting to put up Jose Altuve. We want our polarizing guy. And for years, he was the best second baseman in baseball. Everybody loved Jose Altuve. The 5'6" ball player, 5'10", whatever he is. And everybody loved Jose Altuve until the cheating scandal came out. Somewhat similar to our pitcher, who we'll get to momentarily. But I just had to go with Altuve. Our shortstop, they had Ozzie Smith. And no one can compare to Ozzie Smith today. No, not even. So Ozzie Smith was one of the best players in baseball, one of the best shortstops in baseball history. I don't ever remember seeing him play, but it was amazing, and he was a great player. So what ends up happening with him is he ends up falling into the Springfield mystery spot, I believe it was. So what ends up happening is he's like, oh yeah, I gotta go to the game, but there's a tour, there's this mystery spot thing, I wanna check it out. So he goes into it, it's a vortex, he keeps falling and falling and falling and falling. And I have Francisco Lindor replacing him, which is great, replacing an AL Central player with an AL Central player. Lindor is younger than Ozzie Smith, but Lindor, I almost went with Fernando Tatis Jr. here, but I went with Lindor and went with Soto as my young kid, like I said before. And I'm a big fan of Lindor. He might not offer the power of, say, Trevor Story, but he can get on base a lot, even without walking. So I had to go with Lindor. At third base, they had Wade Boggs. Now, Boggs was one of the best third basemen in the league, and Wade Boggs actually, he gets in a fight with one of the bar characters, Barney Gumble, and they fight about who the best British Prime Minister is. And yeah, let me just say, if I ever am with you, it's Lauren Palmerstrom, not Pitt the Elder. Sorry, but Barney can throw a punch. So I replaced him with Jose Ramirez, and Jose Ramirez is one of the best third basemen in baseball. He's around the same age as Wade Boggs was during this episode, a little younger. But at this point, too, both of them were great players who never had a World Series ring because the teams around them can't seem to get over the hump. Boggs would get a ring in the future when he joined the Yankees, but at this point in time, he didn't have it. Jose Ramirez, great guy. He has the power to replace him, be a good third baseman. And he's with Francisco Lindor, his real battering mate in real life. I'll go with catcher. So they had Mike Scioscia. Scioscia was at the end of his career. He actually only played one more year after this episode aired. And Mike Scioscia was one of the better catchers in the league. He wasn't like an elite guy. He's more known as a starting, he's more known as a manager. But he was a pretty good catcher, all said and done. So what ends up happening with him in this episode is he had the weird one. He gets radiation poisoning. Okay, that's what it was. So he goes to the nuclear power plant. He takes his new job seriously. And he gets radiation poisoning because he wasn't wearing any protective gear and he was pushing around nuclear radiation waste. And that's how they get rid of him for the episode. I had a hard time replacing him. And I was really torn between Buster Posey and Yadier Molina. And I even looked at other guys like JT Realmuto and Gary Sanchez. But I had to go with Posey. Posey has the most power of him and Molina because those were the two I came down to. I almost flipped a coin, but I went with power because it's softball. And Posey had a little bit of a longer, a little more impactful peak. He has an MVP award. Molina does not. I was very happy to have Buster Posey on my team here. He didn't play in 2020. Hopefully he comes back soon and continues to dominate. But if you ask anyone who the best catcher in baseball is for the past 10 years, you're going to get a lot of people who say Posey. You're going to get some who say Molina. It depends on where you are. Both of them have won multiple World Series with their teams. So, and lastly, the starting pitcher, they had Roger Clemens. Clemens is a little bit of a polarizing player because of PEDs again. They end up having him get hypnotized. He thinks he's a chicken. It's weird. And I replaced him with Clayton Kershaw. I mean, you can't compare. Clayton Kershaw is the best pitcher in baseball right now. Don't get me wrong. I would have loved to put Bieber here, but I couldn't do it over like 10 or 15 other players. Kershaw was the guy I had to put here. But that is our Homer at the Bat 2020 version. This is who I would put. Again, assuming I don't have players like Ryan Sandberg and Carlton Fisk say no. Those were the two big guys that said no. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, this was an episode I really looked forward to doing. Homer at the Bat was one of my favorite episodes. Honestly, it's one of my favorite episodes, period, of any TV show. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a good rest of your day. And again, if you haven't seen Homer at the Bat, check it out, Season 3 of The Simpsons.